For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast, or welcome if it's your first time. I'm Jay Black and today I'm doing something a little different. I thought I'd do a little sort of series. I'm doing a little thing about the different themes that come up in the determined ones. Because obviously these vary a bit by book, but there are a few that are consistent throughout the compendium. So I thought it would be pretty fun to talk about those, sort of more in depth, how it comes up and all those sorts of things. So today I am tackling probably the biggest one, or one of the big three for sure, in mental health. Mental health is a huge part of the determined ones. It affects all of my characters in various different ways at different times, and I think it's really important to have mental health feature in dark literature in particular, because I think I have mentioned this particular point before at some point on the podcast, but the whole idea with dark literature is the really bad, awful, horrible things happen. That's kind of the thing. And if you're talking about a whole novel's worth of that, it's going to take a toll. So having the mental health there and a mental health struggle is, to me, that's just realism. And actually you do need that in dark literature, in my eyes, for it to feel properly complete. And beyond that, I find it important within my writing because I have a lot of male main characters, and there's still a huge stigma around men's mental health. For some reason that's still going on, that men aren't supposed to have feelings and all of that sort of nonsense. And especially writing in first person and again dealing with all these situations, I think it's really important to have that there to show that no, this is, everybody has feelings, whether we like to admit it or not. We're all human at the end of the day, and we all have our struggles. And I do think that's important. And the other part of this that I think is important is that sometimes it's not anyone's fault that you have, these issues. It's not necessarily about the situation that you're in or the things that happen. There is a huge genetic element to mental health. I mean, I can't remember, I did see a stat once for how much of depression is genetic, and it's like 85% of depression is just because it's passed down through genetics. That happens, that's just how it is. And that's no one's fault, it just happens. And also that just because a situation improves, say someone has depression or PTSD or something, that doesn't mean that it just goes away. That's not how, mental health issues work. They can improve, but they're never, gone. There are still struggles with them, sometimes for, reasons. Things happen that, remind you of other things that happened, and sometimes there's not a reason. And things just flare up, and it happens. And I think all of that, especially in something like dark literature, where you're dealing with a lot of tough subject matter, I think that is all really important. And it's not something I purposely put in my writing, but it just sort of happens because that's just life, that's human experience. But there are reasons why this does come up as much as it does on page, and why my characters do get these afflictions, if for want of a better phrase, I guess, there are reasons that it's such a big deal in the determined ones. And one of the main ones is, oppression. Oppression is another big theme of the determined ones. And, I mean, the two go hand in hand, to me. Because it's not the oppression of, the other person in the room, it's the oppression of the self, a lot of the time, with the determined ones. A lot of my characters are, a lot of them are gay or bi, so a lot of them fall foul of that sort of discrimination, and there's racism, naturally, because I mean, that's again just life and realism and all kinds of other types of oppression, particularly for poor Curtis. And again, if this is just happening for years and decades, and it takes a toll on you. It just does, and that does affect people, slightly differently, and I'll talk about that a bit later on, but even just seeing other people's oppression, and this is something that really gets to Haru, being so deeply involved in human rights and trying to improve human rights laws across the continent, seeing other people's oppression does take a toll on him. Another one of the really big things in the determined ones that really impacts a lot of characters' mental health, and this isn't just main characters either, is, the war. And when I say the war, because there are a few different ones, I mean the Hukai-Salfjordvik War. It goes on for 6 years, and that is covered pretty comprehensively in Shadow on the Snow, but it's mentioned in, I think, every single other book in the determined ones. It's a massive deal. I mean, a lot of my characters are Hukis, so that's why, and then Helga Salfjordven, so again, big deal there. But even for Curtis, who's down in Malasar, a long way away, and the war has ended a good while before his project starts, the ripple effect from it is huge. And, there are towns destroyed on both sides, and, just the soldiers returning and what they had to do and the things they saw, and the citizens as well, hearing the stories, having to flee their homes and dealing with the what-ifs all the time. I mean, again, it just takes a toll after, not very long. And that's the same for other countries looking in, and particularly Malasar being a wealthy nation, and a nation that does a lot of manufacture of weapons, and how they end up tied into it all. It's a lot for everybody across the land to deal with. And stress as well. I mean, this goes hand in hand with the war and oppression and everything else, but stress, just in general, with, the determined ones as main characters in particular. I mean, it's kind of in the name, they just get so much done, there's such drive, there's such need to do what they do and do it as best as possible and as fast as possible. There's a lot of stress that goes with that, and that is going to take a toll if that's just semi-constantly there, especially with the oppression on top. I mean, that does a number on Coney, but more on that later. And also, life as well. What I think Haru's biggest struggles aren't necessarily even plot related. That's about stuff that happens in his personal life, and that's the stuff that hurts him the most. Because again, it's not necessarily anybody's fault. If someone just, keels over, there's a ripple effect from that. And there's going to be, pain as a result of that. It just happens, that is just life. And a lot of it stems from backstory for a lot of my characters as well. A lot of them have a long history of mental health issues, so is a very obvious one. He had a very interesting childhood, to put it one way. So, he has a lot of trauma from that time, you know, arguable PTSD from that time. He definitely has an amount of PTSD from the war, but you could definitely make the case for him having that from his childhood as well. And, you know, he's got mutism as a result of the PTSD, that's sort of a fragment of that, and depression as well, and whether that's because of trauma from childhood and all that, or whether that's genetic, I mean, we'll never know on that one. I suspect it's some of both. But yeah, Ai has a long history of mental health, and over time it does get worse because of the war and because of the oppression. I mean, the war in particular really does do things to poor Ai over time. And seeing who he is at the beginning of Shadow on the Snow and towards the end is it's a little sobering when you go back and do the next pass of edits. Let's put it that way. And there's also something a lot later in the timeline, towards the end of the Determined One's timeline, that happens. And it is a spoiler to say what it is, so I'm not going to. But that's when he gets really close to his breaking point. I mean, you could very much make the case that he just is well beyond his breaking point at that point. But, yeah. The Determined One's timeline is rough on Ai. Coney is another one who has a long backstory of mental health issues in a similar way to Ai. A lot of the time he has, again, he had an interesting father, let's put it that way. And so, again, trauma from that time. And there is some generational trauma with Coney as well, for sure. His parents were, they were an odd match, and not very healthy people. And that did end up being passed down to both of the kids. Coney has an older sister. And a lot of it for Coney with the oppression, because he's so aware of that. So constantly aware of that. More so than all of my other Hugh Keyes characters, Coney is just so hyper aware of it. And Coney has a tendency to... he's very highly strung. So all of the stress and all of that is worse for him than most of my other characters. And oh boy, does that take a toll on him. I mean, his mindset changes a lot. And how he views the future and how he plans for that changes a lot over the course of Penstemons. And it really does impact his physical health as well. I mean, we know what stress can do for your health, and Coney gets a very bad hand on that one. Isamu is another one whose backstory is covered somewhat in Count the Stars, which is available now for what it's worth. But there's a whole other layer of backstory in there that is hinted at, but not covered, because that happened a good amount of time before that point. And yeah, Isamu's got some pretty deep issues as a result of that. And you don't really see it with him, though, at least from the outside, because he masks it all so well. And you do get it a bit on the inside. I mean, you do see that with Count the Stars and how, I don't want to say paranoid, but he gets jumpy with certain things, I guess. I'm not really sure what the word I'm looking for is, at least not off the top of my head. How it manifests later on, because as seen on stage starts when he's 28, whereas in Count the Stars he's 16. I don't know exactly how that looks internally for him at that point. I suspect he is deeper buried by then, so he appears more okay, but I very much doubt he is. I mean, time will tell with that one, and maybe by then this will be an episode that needs to be revisited. Who knows? I've talked about Curtis a little bit already, but I want to talk about him a little more. So again, very, very bad parents. Just unarguably horrendously abusive parents Curtis has on so many levels at this point, honestly. And he does have issues with, I think, just straight anxiety, and you could definitely make the case for some generational trauma with him as well. And Shinichi's a little different on this one, because, I mean, I don't really know what his early childhood was like, but there doesn't seem to have been any parental influence at all for a significant portion of his early childhood. And he didn't want it there when it was eventually, sort of semi-forced on him in the orphanage that he did most of his growing up in. But yeah, I mean, that's gonna do things to you. And Shinichi has a lot of anxiety. He really doesn't like silence in particular. It's something he really, really struggles with. And in the war, it just gets worse for him. Because it's not just that silence bothers him intrinsically because he's uncomfortable in silence. It's okay, but what's happening in the silence? And when it is too quiet, he just starts thinking about, things he can't control and can't do anything about, and it sends him into a spiral really, really quickly towards the end of the books. And that's not the easiest to see. Not the easiest to watch, that one. Helga's backstory is sort of an interesting one on this one, because her early childhood, again, I'm not entirely sure what exactly happened there, but it was not good. But she ended up on her own very young and stayed on her own in a sort of nomadic lifestyle for a very, very long time. So she has, a big fear of wolves as a result of that. I don't know exactly what happened there, but I think we can get a pretty good idea just from context. But with Helga, what has been harder for her is adjusting to being part of a civilization again, because she spent so long on her own and so many of her formative years on her own, that when it comes to not only being part of, a town and having a non-moving house to live in, that's genuinely something that she struggles to adjust to, is just having a static home. But not just being there and being around other people and talking to other people, but being in charge of other people and being expected to take responsibility for other people and the direction that the nation's heading in and all of that. I don't think she ever does fully adjust to that. And some of her inner struggles with that is quite strange. And again, it does her duties and the sense of duty she feels to sort of prove herself in a lot of ways, which is partly the whole being a woman in charge of herself Yodavik thing, which is not fun. Again, it takes a real toll on her physical health doing all of that. And Hanzo, I think, has some genetic depression, although the war really brings it out on him. I mean, Hanzo is a very key player in the war. And I just don't think it's all of the stuff that he hears and has to deal with that nobody else really sees. I mean, Jiro gets hints of it, but no one else really, really sees what Hanzo has to deal with, staying, days at a time in the office. He just doesn't leave, he sleeps, badly on the sofa, and he remarks on this a couple of times about, oh, I haven't showered in I haven't washed in 3 days, and my hair is so greasy, I'm slightly afraid to touch it, and it's going to be gross. And he doesn't ever fully recover from the war, I don't think. I think the toll it takes on him does last forever, and there's an amount. I mean, his physical health is already pretty ruined before then for other things I can't really say for plot reasons and spoilers, but his mindset changes a lot because of the war, and he just becomes a lot more nihilistic, and not about Hyukai particularly, but just about himself and everything. As very much an, okay, we made it this far, but like at what cost, and also kind of what's the point anymore? And he gets better about that, and much later in the timeline I think he does find different motivations around things, but he gets a lot more reckless and careless about things because he's seen the worst that there is to see, and he just doesn't bother him anymore. He's made his own peace with a lot of stuff, so in a very weird way he becomes, to himself, incredibly fragile because, I mean, his health is destroyed physically and he doesn't really know how to defend himself. He has a tanto and he could take a couple of stabs, but he doesn't really know what he's doing with it. So he's aware he's very fragile, but he also becomes a weirdly untouchable because he's just not really afraid of anything anymore. And he has his own, a dead man switch, I think is the phrase I'm looking for. Like, once he dies, that sets off a chain reaction. Because, of course it does, this is Hanzo. So he just doesn't really fear very much, and it's a very odd position to be in mentally, and it's a lot of mental gymnastics. Hanzo's a very, very weird guy. But the overall impact of mental health on a lot of the determined ones, really, is there's a lot of self-destruction that happens. Like, there is with, honestly, kind of all of them. You know, they know that their mental and physical health is suffering because they're working too much, but that comes second, or third, or fourth, or, I mean, it's dimly in the back of their mind, but it doesn't really bear properly thinking about, and that's the best of that. I mean, at worst, it is, I know I'm actively destroying myself doing this thing, but what does it really matter? In the end, there are bigger things to worry about, and yes, that's Hanzo with, you know, I've only got one lung and I'm still smoking cigarettes because I'm smart like that, but it's not restricted to just Hanzo. There are others who have the, I know I'm actively destroying myself, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway, and they're so self-aware about it a lot of the time, it's very uncomfortable. And there's also a huge protector instinct that comes from their own struggles. I mean, Hanzo in particular, I've mentioned how protective he is before on the podcast. He wants to protect everybody because he has suffered. He has, and he's very aware that he's suffered, and he doesn't want anyone else to go through what he's gone through. And he's always had that for a long time. You know, as a teenager, he had that. But that gets bigger and bigger over time, to the extent that he just stops really talking to his siblings at all because he thinks it's safer to just not talk to them about things in case, you know, someone tries to be underhand and get to him through them, basically. But it's true for a lot of other characters as well. I mean, I spend a lot of time trying to protect Coney at different points and really sticks his neck out for Coney at one point, and Haru actually tells him off for doing it because he gets annoyed when Ai puts himself in that sort of danger, and he's quite cute in Mr. Nakagami in its own way, but there's a lot of people trying to protect each other, and sometimes keeping those secrets is not the right thing to do, and sometimes they're aware of that, but the instincts get in the way. It's not pride, but it's a similar sort of roadblock in that way. I has a particularly unique one. A particularly unique impact happens with I and mental health and his struggles, because he gets to a point, and it is a spoiler to say exactly what happens, but it is the sort of the moment that kicks off Black Executioner. A certain thing happens, and he is at rock bottom. He is, mentally, or at least he thinks he is. He's very, very close, at the least, and he just decides, you know what? Why not just go full ham here? I'll just take an initiative. I'll do this big thing, because what more have I got to lose? And it's not the same as Hanzo with his, oh, I'm gonna die anyway, so who cares? It's a different thing with I, because he doesn't have any intent on dying, but it's just, well, things can't get any worse, so I might as well do my damnedest to make it better. He's healthy, he's fine. You know, every single character has been mentioned in this episode, and I've been talking pretty strictly about main characters this episode, but it doesn't just affect them. I mean, you see this, I think, most pertinently in Snakebite, that Hanzo's struggles are seen by his found family, and are felt by his found family, and they're felt very deeply by some of his found family. And it's the same with all of them. They all have their friends and their found families that all have these troubles. And some of that is, you know, their own story, and some of that is impact from the determined ones and their story. And it's such a huge theme, not only within the determined ones, but just with my writing in general. I think this is a topic that I'm going to revisit a few times over the course of, you know, however long I do this podcast for, you know, hopefully sort of ad infinitum, but we'll see. It's something that's going to come up a lot, and for me, when I talk about mental health, be that my own mental health in the anniversary episode of the podcast, or for my characters and in my writing, it's important to me to not sanitize it, and to show how horrible a lot of it really is, because otherwise it feels disingenuous to me. And if you're gonna do something, do it properly, and particularly with something that's this important and this pertinent to, you know, life and life experience, it has to be done right. And especially in adult literature, I don't see the point in pretending that, you know, depression can't lead to suicidal ideation, and that suicidal ideation isn't, you know, just a one-off thing, and it just, you know, it happens once and it goes away and everything's fine. And, you know, for one person in a million that might be true, but that's not the vast majority of cases. And if you're gonna handle that, I think it's important to be honest about what mental health and mental illness is really like, if that's going to be a part of your writing. That's my view on it, and I think it's particularly important in dark literature to really get the impact of what's happening. To get how horrible this is, it has to deeply affect the people it's affecting, because otherwise, you know, something's missing from that, in my view. But I think that's probably about all I have to say on this one. However, mental health is something that comes up in a lot of books, particularly indie books, and if you too are a writer, and you're published or well on the way, please do get in touch. I would love to be a part of your journey. Indie and Self-Pub, you are the people I want to hear from. A few things to note: there is a list of things I want to know in the description. Please include that in your initial contact. My email's on the screen, so that I don't have to give automatic no's or any of that nonsense, because that's no good for anybody at the end of the day. There's no genre restriction. All genres are welcome, all age categories are welcome. It doesn't have to be a novel. Novellas are very welcome, poetry, whatever you've got, bring it in. Let's see what we can do. And if you're looking for me elsewhere, well, I'm in quite a lot of places these days, doing quite a lot of different things. So Instagram is somewhat the home of the podcast, where you get advance notice of what the episode for the week is, soundbite teaser reels, all of that sort of stuff. But there's also more happening on Instagram lately. I'm trying to do more stuff around the indie book community and shouting out amazing books and amazing authors, and there's going to be a big whole thing about that towards the end of the year. So if you want to see more stuff about... So if all that sort of stuff interests you, check out Instagram. I'm Jade_Black21 on that. And if you are looking to find my writing, get semi-live updates on my writing, and potentially join the Monthly Thrills community, that's Twitter. That is JadeBlack21. And if you're looking for exclusive world building and exclusive art, and a lot of my art does have mental health themes in it, and there is some pretty exclusive stuff around that too, and that's on Pinterest. That is Jade_Black21. So wherever you are, I'm probably there too, so hit me up and enjoy the ride. And until next time, you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like. It helps the channel a lot. Intro and outro music by me. Copyright J Black 2024.